Many people notice the same pattern. They decide to change something, feel energized for a few days, and then the drive quietly disappears. A new routine begins with clarity and determination. The first mornings feel structured. The first tasks are completed with focus. There is a sense of momentum. Then, without a clear external obstacle, that energy weakens. The plan remains logically valid, but internally it feels heavier. This shift is often interpreted as a lack of discipline. People assume that if motivation fades, it must mean they were not serious enough. But the consistency of this pattern across different personalities, goals, and environments suggests something more structural. The drop in motivation is not random. It follows a predictable psychological arc. At the beginning of any change, attention is concentrated. The decision itself creates a temporary narrowing of focus. The future outcome feels vivid. The mind simplifies complexity and highlights potential gains. In this early stage, effort is experienced as meaningful rather than costly. What most people do not consciously register is that this initial phase is emotionally amplified. Novelty activates the brain's reward system. The contrast between who I am now and who I could become generates tension that feels like energy. This energy is often mistaken for stable motivation. As days pass, the novelty decreases. The behavior becomes repetitive. The emotional contrast fades. At that point, the real psychological cost of the change becomes visible: fatigue, competing responsibilities, limited cognitive bandwidth. The nervous system recalculates effort against available resources. From the outside, it looks like a loss of willpower. Internally, it is often a shift from emotional activation to resource reality. The tension lies not in character weakness, but in the gap between initial intensity and sustainable capacity. To understand why motivation collapses after a few days, it is useful to look at how effort and reward were structured earlier in life. Many people grow up in environments where effort is linked to short bursts of urgency rather than steady consistency. School deadlines, parental pressure, exams, or moments of evaluation often create intense but temporary activation. Effort becomes associated with spikes of stress, followed by relief. In such conditions, the brain learns a pattern. Mobilize strongly when something feels urgent, then disengage once the emotional pressure decreases. This is not laziness, it is adaptation. The nervous system becomes efficient at responding to peaks, not at sustaining moderate, repetitive effort without external reinforcement. Consider a common example. A child receives attention and praise mainly when achieving visible results: high grades, competition wins, noticeable improvement. The reward is not tied to daily process, but to outcome. Over time, the brain connects motivation with anticipation of recognition. When recognition is absent or delayed, the internal drive weakens quickly. Another example: someone grows up in a household where stability is inconsistent. Emotional tension, financial unpredictability, or changing expectations. In such environments, focusing on long-term gradual effort may not feel psychologically safe. The brain prioritizes short-term control and rapid visible progress because uncertainty makes distant rewards feel unreliable. As adults, these early adaptations remain active. When starting a new habit, the brain initially responds with intensity because it interprets change as a significant event. Novelty resembles urgency, but once the situation becomes stable and repetitive, the learned pattern activates. Without external pressure or immediate reward, sustained effort feels unnecessary or even inefficient. The brain constantly conserves energy. If previous experiences taught it that intense short-term effort is sufficient for survival or approval, it will default to that strategy. Motivation disappears not because the goal is meaningless, but because the nervous system is following a familiar, historically adaptive model of engagement. When this pattern continues into adulthood, it begins to shape broader areas of life. At work, a person may perform intensely at the beginning of a project, impress others with speed and initiative, and then gradually lose momentum once the task becomes routine. This can create a cycle of strong first impressions followed by quiet disengagement. Externally, it may look inconsistent. Internally, it feels like a repeated loss of energy without a clear explanation. In relationships, a similar dynamic can appear. Early stages are fueled by novelty and emotional activation. Attention is focused, communication is frequent, effort feels natural. Over time, as the relationship stabilizes, the emotional intensity decreases. If the nervous system equates activation with meaning, calm stability may be misinterpreted as loss of interest. The person may seek new stimulation or emotionally withdraw, not out of indifference, but because steady connection requires a different type of psychological endurance. Financial decisions can follow the same structure. There may be bursts of strict budgeting or ambitious planning, followed by periods of avoidance. The internal system struggles to maintain moderate, ongoing regulation without external pressure. This creates a subtle internal paradox. The person often values independence, ambition, and self-control. They are capable of strong activation and decisive action. Yet the very intensity that feels like strength produces tension. Sustained effort without urgency feels unnatural. Independence reduces external pressure, but also removes the stimulation that previously triggered engagement. As a result, autonomy can gradually turn into isolation or quiet anxiety. The conflict remains difficult to see because the individual identifies with the moments of intensity. Those moments feel authentic and powerful. The quieter periods are interpreted as weakness or distraction, rather than as signals of a mismatched engagement strategy. Without recognizing the underlying mechanism, the person experiences repeated frustration without understanding the structural cause. When a person begins to understand this pattern, the experience of losing motivation changes in tone. It stops being evidence of weakness and becomes information. The model itself is not good or bad. It is a logical adaptation to earlier conditions. Intense activation followed by disengagement once served a purpose. It helped conserve energy, gain approval, or manage unpredictability. What changes with awareness is not the immediate behavior, but the interpretation. Instead of reacting to the drop in motivation with self-criticism or renewed pressure, a person may start to notice the sequence more neutrally. Emotional surge, strong start, gradual depletion, withdrawal. The cycle becomes observable rather than personal. This observation introduces space. In that space, the internal conflict softens. The individual may begin to see that their strength, the ability to mobilize quickly and act decisively, is real. At the same time, the tension created by relying only on intensity becomes visible. Independence no longer needs to prove itself through constant effort. Stability no longer has to feel like stagnation. Understanding the mechanism also reduces unnecessary drama around normal fluctuations of energy. Motivation is no longer treated as a permanent state that must be preserved at all costs. It is recognized as variable, influenced by context, recovery, and meaning. The nervous system's recalculations are not betrayals. They are adjustments. This shift does not immediately solve inconsistency or prevent fatigue, but it replaces confusion with coherence. The pattern becomes understandable, and when behavior is understood, it becomes less threatening. The disappearance of motivation after a few days may not be a failure of character. It may simply be the nervous system following an old strategy. Recognizing that strategy does not force change. It allows a quieter relationship with one's own effort, one based less on pressure and more on clarity.